little boy one time was out viewing starry skies. And there was a man that approached him. He said, "Son, are you a believer in God?" He said, "Yes, I am." The man said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I give you $25 if you tell me where God's not." He said, "Sir, if you can tell me where, or if you can show me where God is." He said, "Sir, if you can tell me where God's not, I'll give you $100. God's everywhere." We know that, and we know that in time of need and desperation that we need God, and God has promised to be there for us. In Psalm 46, and that's our psalm for the night, or our lesson for the night. If you have your Bibles, you might want to turn to Psalm 46. We're going to read it in just a minute. But we're in a series of blessed assurance, and the assurance is that which is found in the very first verse of the 46th Psalm. God is our refuge and strength, very present help in time of trouble. And then verse 10, we'll find some more comfort in that psalm. But we understand through life that we really want comfort, and we need comfort, and we need help. And the psalmist says, run to God. That's where you go. God is our refuge. God is our help. And so many times in the troubles of life, we pull back. We're like the proverbial cat. You know, if a cat gets sick, a lot of times what do? They pull back, and even if they get sick to the point of death, they may run away instead of dying at home, which is really strange in and of itself, but nevertheless it's true. And Christians do the same a lot of times, not just Christians, but people. They claim a close relationship with God, but when troubles come, they pull back. And yet the psalmist says God's our refuge and strength. When the 46th Psalm was written, we do not know. History has kind of put an interesting twist on it, if you will. Some of the historians have said that Psalm 46 was written. You might recall when Sennacherib, a Syrian king and leader, was leading the Syrians against the Israelites. Hezekiah, Isaiah 37, 2 Kings chapter 19. And you remember that Hezekiah, who was a righteous king, confronted God because he knew that Sennacherib was about to invade. And he asked God for deliverance. And God said, I'll do it. And immediately nothing happened, but Sennacherib went to bed that night, and he was woke up the next day. The report was that the angel of death had passed over the camp, if you will, and many of the soldiers had died, and the rest that remained packed up and went home. God delivered Israel, just as Hezekiah had prayed. Some say that when this psalm was written, I don't know, and no one really knows for sure. But in it, the psalmist reminds us of several things that are good and noteworthy. Let's read the psalm. God's our refuge and strength, very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. Selah. I'm not testing your intelligence, but I do want you to understand, when you read the word Selah in Psalms, you got to remember that Psalms were the songs of that day, but also remember that the songs of that day were more like what we would call chants. We might even go as far as to call them, are very similar to the Gregorian chants. And the word Selah just is a rest, the pause. Another way of saying is, think about it. So he goes on, verse 4. There's a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, and she shall not be moved. God shall help her just as the break of dawn. The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge, Selah. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made the desolations of the earth. He makes war, ceases to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot in the fire. Be still and know that I am God. I'll be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. Now there's several things in that psalm, several things that are interesting. You might notice that especially verse 11, you also see it in verse 7. Same thing. The Lord's the host. We'll talk about it as we get there. But if you read that psalm, one of the first things you find out is life doesn't go the way we often plan for it to go and the way we think maybe it even should go. And that's true, isn't it? Life doesn't always go the way we planned it, doesn't go the way we think it should go. We can wish it, we can hope it, we can dream it, we can even plan it. But that doesn't mean life will go the way we want it to. Think about 2 Samuel, the 7th chapter. God talks to David. David had made all of these plans about building the temple. He was going to build that place of worship. He was going to build it for God. He had all of these plans made out. And God visited him in 2 Samuel 7. He said, you're not going to do it. You're a man of war. Don't want a man of war doing that. And so ultimately, of course, Solomon did finish. Solomon built the temple, but there were the plans. Deuteronomy 32 is another time. We were reminded of when a man made plans, but his plans didn't come about like he had hoped. You know, Moses had planned on going into the promised land. Moses had led the children of Israel. Moses had shown them the way to go and had led them and had made, if you will, all the decisions for them, had done everything he could. Of course, we do know he made a mistake in there. God wouldn't let him go in. He had thought he would go in, but in Deuteronomy 32, God says, you're not going in. You can see in. We'll take you up to the high mountain. We'll let you see in, but you're not going in. And there on that mountain, he died. His plans were made, but his plans weren't fulfilled. That doesn't mean that he still didn't count God as a refuge. It's just simply to say that in life we make plans, but our plans don't always come out the way we need them. In Psalm 46, our psalm tonight, if you noticed in the first 3 verses, you notice several things. You notice the psalmist talking about landslides. You notice him talking about earthquakes. You notice him talking about storms, terrible storms in the oceans. You notice him talking about trouble, difficulty, terrible times. And he says, basically, in the midst of all that, he says, look, you need to know that God's your refuge. Even though you might plan, even though you might take precautions, even though you might do everything you can, we're sort of like Job. In Job chapter 3, Job had taken a lot of precautions, and Job, after he'd lost everything, remember by Job 3, Job had lost family, he had lost friends, he had lost health, he had lost everything. He'd lost everything but God. And Job in Job chapter 3, verse 26 says, and yet trouble came, no matter the precautions I took. Trouble still came. It's a reality of life, whether we like to mention it or not, whether we like to think about it or not, we suffer. The pendulum of life goes back and forth, doesn't it? The reality of it is the only one that has this, everything's all right, they lived happily ever after, is Hallmark Channel. That's the only one that has it. Yes, I watch the Hallmark Channel from time to time. You know why? I'm married. That's why. I love my wife. When Ethan watches them with us sometimes, he and Kara, and I just look at him and I say, it'll be over when they kiss. So we're rooting for them to hurry up and kiss. Hallmark Channel. Yes, they have happy endings. And we have happy endings. Let's don't walk away and think, oh, you know, life's miserable, life's terrible. If you really look at your life, for the most part, has more mundane time than it does anything. It has highs and lows, yes. It has peaks, it has valleys, it has good times, it has tough times. But for the most part, we just kind of get through life. We sail through life. But it is, especially in those valleys, that we have to understand that blessed assurance that God's our refuge. Yes, life has its pendulum, life has its way of ups and downs and backs and forths, but God's still there. God is our refuge. We may understand, we may even feel as David felt. In Psalm 142 and verse 4, David said, I looked on my right hand and no one was there. I looked on my right hand. I looked and no one was there. I looked for help and no one was there. I looked for someone to deliver me. It's much like, the feeling of Jesus. Where were people? Life doesn't go as we planned it, and the psalmist says you need to know that as we go and as we walk along, as we make all of these plans, personal problems come, heartaches come, disappointment comes, illness comes, emotional problems come, family problems come, society and societal problems come. We have these difficulties. So life doesn't go as we plan. Okay. But here's the assurance. Here's the blessed assurance. God's our refuge. The word refuge, the Hebrew word, has the connotation, the idea of a shelter. And it's sort of like the song that we sing from time to time, a shelter in the time of storm. Well, that's really what the Hebrew word has. It's the idea of a shelter that could be run to when there was a storm coming. And so, here's what the psalmist says. When the earthquakes come, when the landslides come, when the storms come, in the ocean and the deep, you can run to God because he's our refuge. So much so that the psalmist goes on to say, we'll not fear. With God being our refuge, there's several things you have to know and several things that are implied. All of that. First of all, the accessibility of God, the fact that we can get to him, the fact that he's a God at hand and not a God afar off. Psalm 118, verse 26. Verse 6, excuse me. Am I not a God at hand? And the answer is yeah. You're right there. You're right there. In Psalm 139, remember the psalmist said, there's nowhere that I can go. I'm paraphrasing now. There's nowhere that I can go that you're not there. You're everywhere. And he is. With God being our refuge, we're like the little boy. Tell me where God's not. God is accessible. We can get to him. He is, while he sits on his high throne, we need to remember that he's not sitting so high that he doesn't care, and not sitting so high that you can't reach him. Jeremiah 33:3 is one of my favorite verses. And Jeremiah is reminded by God, call upon me and I will answer. Call upon me and I will answer. So, with God as our refuge, we have one who is accessible. But that means that he's present. That means that he's there. That means that he's here. Verse 7 and verse 11, what did they say? It says that God, the God of Jacob, God of hosts, is our refuge. Now, I want to come back to that idea again. But God being accessible, God being present, God being at hand, we sometimes feel as if God has forsaken us. Even Jesus hanging on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? When we go through those difficult times, those troubles, those heartaches, those times of disappointments, those times of heartbreaks, those times where we don't understand, that's the feeling. Because we believe that God is with us and thus everything runs smoothly. God never promised us that life would be smooth sailing. God never promised us life would be happily ever after. God promised to be there in the midst of our troubles. And so God is a God at hand. God's powerful. With God being our refuge, we know that he is able to do exceedingly abundant. We know of his great power. We see it every day when we look around. Have you looked in the last day or two at all the colors of the trees? Suzanne and I were going down Old Hickory this afternoon. And man, of course, you go from here towards 100, you see a lot of mountains, a lot of hills. When you see those hills, you see all the trees, and you see the yellows and the reds and the golden colors, and you see all the beauty, the beauty of the hand of God, and you think about God in his power created all of that. He upholds all things by the power of his word. God is a God that's powerful. If God is our refuge, He has to be powerful, because we need strength from time to time. We need someone to give us strength, and in order to give us strength, you've got to have strength. Imagine, if you will, going through a tough time, trying to find a friend that will help you, and you find one that's going through a tough time too. It's very difficult to receive strength from them because they don't have strength to give, because they're fighting their own fight, their own battle at that time. It's not to say that they can't, and it's not to say that they don't want to. It's just the strength that they have is going towards their own cause. But with God, we have a powerful God. We have a God who is considered the God of hosts. Did you catch that in verse 7 and verse 11? Do you know what that means? I think you probably do. He's the commander of the army. That's what it means, literally, in Hebrew. He's the commander of the army. He's the one in charge. He's our refuge. The God of Israel, the psalmist said, God of Jacob, is our refuge. But then it also, when you talk about God being our refuge, is God cares for us. God cares what goes on to us. But not only does God care about what's going on to us, God cares about what's going on. And He wants it all to be all right. While He is there, while He is present. He has been present. He is present. He will be present. But we have to know that He cares, that He's willing to help, that He has not forsaken us to the standpoint of saying, you're on your own. When Jesus claimed or asked and shouted out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's really going back to Psalm 22, but yet at the same time too, He understands God's there. Could it be a moment of doubt? Have we missed that with regards to our preaching and teaching? That really that was a moment of doubt within the life of Jesus? No, I don't think so. But He's just asking for a little help. He's asking for a little assurance. I need you to take care of me. I need you to care. And I need you to help me out. And so God helps us. He helps us. He's on our side. Romans chapter 8 or chapter 3 verse 8 reminds us that God is the one to whom salvation belongs. Now think about that for a minute. I want you to go back and in your study this week, go back and read Psalm 3. In Psalm 3, one of the things you'll find out is God is helping His children fight a battle. And so the salvation there might be more from the standpoint of enemies than the salvation of the soul. But he says salvation, verse 8, belongs to the Lord. Who can save us? Who will save us? The answer is simple. It's God. What a blessed assurance we have that in the midst of what's going on in life, we have a shelter to run to. But we have shelter to run to because God is that shelter that cares. He is the one that's present. He is the one that has the power, and He is the one, after all, that's on our side. And so the God of peace shall crush Satan under your feet shortly. That's what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 16 and verse 20. While life seems to have the upper hand, no, the answer is not life, it's God. God has the upper hand. And so we get then understanding, if you will, life doesn't go always as planned. We have God as our refuge, but there's a third point that needs to be made in this. And it's the third point that's made with regards to really, if you will, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. Don't you like that? Be still and know that I'm God. The idea of being still. I like what one guy I read said. He said, you know what the psalmist is saying? Relax. In other words, kick your feet up. Relax. It's going to be all right. You know, what are you trying to do to someone that's in panic or someone that's going through a very difficult time? Isn't that one of the things you try to do is calm them down and to keep them calm? And to keep them calm, you say, relax. You may know they can't relax, and you may not even be relaxed, but you try to relax them, and so you say, be still, be calm. God says, be still. Be still. Relax. It's all right. It's going to be all right. And know. And know. I like that. Because he doesn't say, be still, relax. And it may be all right, or it could be all right, or you know, maybe we'll somehow get it worked out, and we'll try to get it all right. All doubt and all fear is removed by the knowledge of the love of God, by knowing that God's our refuge. And so all fear, all doubt's removed. We don't have that fear. We don't have that doubt. And so the psalmist reminds us, God, be still and know. Well, know what? That I'm God. That I'm the one that's in charge. I'm the one that will take care of you. I'm the one that will assist you. I'm the one that'll get you out of it. I'm the one that will get you through it. I'm the one that's your refuge that you're running to. Be still and know that I'm God. So therefore, quit. Quit what? Quit fretting. Quit fretting. How often do we fret over our difficulties? How often do we fret over what's going on in life? How often do we get upset and fret and complain? Oh, not me, preacher. I'd never complain. Okay, sure. Exodus, the 16th chapter. Moses, bless his heart, leads the children out of Israel, or out of Egyptian bondage, leading them out of Egyptian bondage. Didn't take long for them to start what? Complaining. They were the complainingest group of people. They complained when they were in Egyptian bondage. They got out of Egyptian bondage and they started complaining not long after they got out. They just wanted to complain. And while Paul would remind us to do all things without murmuring and complaining, Philippians 2 verse 14, as Christians we're reminded of that very aspect. Quit complaining. But it's easier to complain, isn't it? And we complain about a lot of things. You know, we complain about the weather. We complain that it's either too hot or too cold. My wife was telling somebody out there this morning about the ideal day for her. I told her that's about 2 days out of the year here in Middle Tennessee. I forgot it's something like 65 and maybe a light breeze and sunny day. I said that's 2 days out of 365 days. Enjoy them. But we complain. We complain about the weather. We complain it's either too hot or it's too cold. It's too wet, it's too dry. We complain. We complain about people. We complain about the way they drive. You know how we do it? Beep, 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 beep. That's how we complain about people. And we complain about their driving. We complain about our neighbors. They either don't mow their yard, or they mow it too close, or they mow our side and we don't like the way they mow because they don't mow straight lines, or they mow straight lines and we want to mow crooked lines because we can't mow straight lines. We complain about the way they mow their yard. We complain about the way they keep their house. You know, why in the world don't they paint their shutters? Why in the world don't they get somebody to fix that roof? Why in the world? And then we complain about what's going on in our life. Oh, I don't feel good. Well, I get that. And I understand that, you know, sometimes we have to make people aware of things. And by the way, please make people aware of things. Don't sit there and feel bad and then your own say, well, no, did anybody know? I had one lady come up to me and she said, nobody in church sent me a card. And I said, I got a question. And she said, yeah. I said, who of us did you let know? Nobody. Last time I checked, I have ESPN, but not ESP. And I could say that to that individual. And she said, you're right. With God as our refuge, though, we really can quit fretting. We really can be individuals that quit, just complaining and talking about everything that from the standpoint of it's just not right. But with God's our refuge, we can quit fearing. We don't fear. The Lord's my helper. I will not fear what man can do unto me. Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 41, verse 10. God's on our side. Romans 8, verse 31. Lord's my helper. I will not fear. The Hebrew writer wrote in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 6. We fear. We fear what could be. We fear what might be, what we think might happen. Now, the reality of it is there are hundreds of fears in this world. Psychologists list really hundreds of fears. We're all born with two. We're born with the fear of noise and the fear of falling. Beyond that, any other fears that you have, you've developed them through the years. Now, you could have fear of anything from spiders and snakes and mice to storms to people to fear of certain things happening, of dying certain ways. I have a fear. I'll tell you what my fear is. My fear really is, other than red-headed women, my fear is driving off a bridge and drowning because I can't swim. So, you say, well, how do you baptize people? Water's only up here, right? But that's my fear. But the psalmist, in telling us that God's our refuge, says, you don't need to fear. God's with you. God's there. God's going to get you through it. And so we can also quit fainting. In other words, don't stop. Often what hinders us in our path of progress in life are the obstacles that come our way and we think they're insurmountable. We can't overcome them. And not only can we not overcome them, but we allow them for us to pull back. And this is when we begin to strain our relationship with God. Not God's part of it, but our part of it. We begin to pull back from God. And as we pull back from God, we begin to quit. Paul said, be steadfast, unmovable, always abound in the work of the Lord. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. We're reminded, don't quit. Don't quit. Keep on going. Keep on doing what you're supposed to be doing. Keep on doing what God would have you to do. Because God's your refuge. You run to Him. You don't run away from Him. Jonah, when God called him to go to Nineveh, ran away from God. And when he ran away from God, what happened? That great fish swallowed him up. I wonder if instead of running away from God, he had done what he did after that great fish swallowed him up. What did he do? He ran towards God. And then he tried to run ahead of God, and then God ultimately called him back, and he ran with God. I wonder how many times if we just simply try to run with God. Don't quit. Don't get ahead of Him. Just stay with Him. Hold His hand. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, Thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. I can't sing that song without remembering the story, and I'm sure you've heard the story. Horatio Spafford wrote that song. When he wrote it, he was living in America with his family, but he had family back across the waters, and he'd sent his wife and his children on ahead of him. He was a businessman. He'd sent them on ahead of him, and they were going by boat. The boat got in a storm, was wrecked. Lives were lost. He lost his wife and his children in the storm. A few months later, he got in a boat to go back to see his family. And as he asked the captain, he says, when we get to such and such spot, please let me know. And the captain did. But the captain wanted to know what's going on. He says, this is where the storm was. This is where the boat, such and such boat went down. This is where I lost my wife, my children. And that right there, when he sat down and wrote, and peace like a river attendeth my soul. Life has a way of running in, doesn't it? But verse 11 reminds us, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob's our refuge. The Lord of hosts, the commander, is in charge. And being the commander that's in charge, he's our refuge. What a great God we have. What a great promise we have. But not only that, but what assurance we have in Psalm 46, that God's our refuge and strength, very present help in time. Next week, Lord willing, we'll find another blessed assurance. We're going to look at three verses that you are very, very familiar with. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. Be sure and come back and be with us then. Tonight, though, as we've talked about God as our refuge, you may need the prayers of the church. You may need to become a child of God by being immersed into Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins. You may have done that and you need to start again. You've had things in your life that you need to ask for prayers for, or you just need prayers for help, prayers for strength, not necessarily prayers for forgiveness. Whatever the case may be, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, I want you to do so. All together we stand and sing.